Hi class, thanks for coming back here, watching the video PowerPoint narration. And here this week we're looking at again, religious for civilizations and how they're created. But this week, in week 5, we're examining the contrasting patterns in India and China, which we did with chapter 12. And here we are looking at, for chapter 13, how religious civilizations have interacted. And we're specifically looking at Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia. So I hope you enjoy watching this and pick up some ideas about how these civilizations interacted. We're first going to take an examination of Korea. And Korea is a peninsula, as you can notice here, surrounded by water on 3 sides. And it is mountainous in the north. You can see here the different mountain ranges, and slightly less hilly throughout the south. Winters tend to be dry and summers are rainy. It's influenced in the south by the monsoon pattern. Wheat and millet were commonly grown in the north, rice in the south. The land was prone to drought, and agriculture is difficult in this region. In this area, ethnically, Koreans probably originated in Central Asia. The language is related to Mongolian, Manchu, and possibly Japanese. The first state in 1000 BCE was the Choson Kingdom, with its capital at Pyongyang. There is evidence, sorry, the clicker is not working for me right now. There we go. There is evidence of Chinese influence from 900 BCE onward. Remember, China is the large nation to Korea's north, right here, it is connected to. So there's evidence of Chinese influence from 900 onward. Evidence includes agricultural techniques such as tools and bronze smelting, iron smelting established in Korea by the 5th century BCE. Han China conquered most of Korea by 108 BCE and used Pyongyang as a regional capital. It began the long tradition of direct Chinese control and influence on Korea. Han resettled Chinese in North Korea to facilitate control. The Koreans fled south or to Japan to resist this influence from their neighbor from the north. So thinking about how that might have been, thinking about how much control here China had over Korea. Korea was trying, and here's Pyongyang. Koreans were fleeing to the south to stay independent. The Han conquered most of Korea by 108 BC, as I mentioned, and used Pyongyang as a regional capital, which you can see more clearly on this map. The Han conquest led Koreans to create 3 kingdoms here in the south. In the north, this teal region was under Chinese control and what had the most Chinese cultural influence. China was eventually driven out of Korea in the 4th century CE. China will reinvade North Korea under the Sui and Tang dynasties. During the time here when China was influencing this region of Korea, Korea was introduced to Buddhism and Confucianism by China. They also introduced Chinese writing and philosophy, and there was a building of a Confucian academy and a reorganization of the state of this teal region here of Korea according to Confucian ideas. Buddhism spreads to this region of China from maritime trade that kept it connected. And then this region also received Buddhism contact and retained its clan and warrior-based aristocracy, even though there was a Chinese style of bureaucracy that it had adopted. These 3 kingdoms often fought with one another for control of the southern tip of the peninsula. Eventually, the Silla region kingdom will have an alliance with China to defeat its neighboring kingdoms. Eventually, there is a surrender, and this and this region here, this Chinese influence region, will surrender in 668. In 735, China reorganizes this region, the Silla region, as a client state in charge of Korea. The Silla in decline and overthrown by Wang Kong in 918, who established the Koryo state. They moved the capital to Kaesong and designed an imitation of a capital or a city in China. Kaesong was conquered by the Mongols in 1231, although the state held on until 1259. About 250,000 Koreans deported as slave laborers to work in the Mongol Empire. Mongol control of China ended in 1368, and the Ming dynasty of China planned to invade Korea. A Confucian Buddhist system was implemented in this region in 722. Korea was a center of Buddhist text production in Asia, including printing, and this is one of the first scripts or first printings that you can see. Before Buddhism, Koreans were animistic, which will continue at the local level. Korea became the center of Buddhist text production in Asia, including printing. Korea had a very literate culture, and in the 15th century developed its own phonetic script. And they are going to be at the center of production for Buddhist texts. So what we need to focus on for this idea or this region is how, and I'm going to go back to this map, how China has influenced Korea with its adoptions of different kinds of faiths. And think about the interaction. Remember, the chapter is called Religious Civilizations Interacting. So how do we see Korea being influenced by China? We're going to take a look next at Japan and how Japan might have been influenced or not influenced by the regions around it. As we know, Japan is an archipelago and is made up of a series of island chains. It has several volcanic islands with a varied climate. The soil is not very arable, but plains and valleys on Honshu are mineral rich. Japan is inhabited by two distinct groups who arrived 10 to 20 years ago, or 20 million years ago. The Utari are similar to the early peoples of Siberia and the Americas, and the second group came from people who settled Southeast Asia and Indonesia. Japan's first culture between 10,000 BCE and 300 BCE were the Womon. Material evidence consists of pottery, clay figures of women, and arrowheads and spheres and tools and phallic symbols. Material evidence consists that people were here inhabiting these islands in that time period. Their society was organized according to matriarchal and matrilineal lines, so tracing the lineage through the female line of their family. Agriculture and bronze work came from contact with Korea, so here we see another one of those interactions. Eurasian grains and other crops appear after 300 BCE. Most important new crop that was introduced was rice. The first true Japanese state was the Yamamoto, located on Honshu. The formation of the Yamamoto was affected by repeated invasions of Korea by China. The Empress Suku and her nephew modeled their leadership style and imperial state on what China was doing. Later, Buddhism was adopted as a state religion in 598. The Chinese lunar calendar was used for record keeping, and the prince implemented a 17-article constitution based on Confucian and Buddhist principles. And you need to, as you're listening to this and thinking, Well, how are these societies and these places interacting? We've just mentioned several times of the influence of China on Japan, and of how they've set up their government, and we've also mentioned here how we see the beginnings of religion and how religion is influencing Japan. The imperial state was expanded. The Chinese-style histories were written and the mandate of heaven concept adopted. So we see a very similar idea, or the same idea, as in China with the mandate of heaven. Hierarchical and bureaucratic systems of government were institutionalized, and uniform taxation and conscription and labor services were created. A law code was issued in 702. It was the basis of Japanese law for centuries, and the first fixed capital was built in Nara in 710. Oh, there was one more thing I wanted to share on this previous slide. The imperial order firmly enforced the capital and provincial administrative centers. A uniform culture at the top was created through literacy. So much like we saw with Korea being very literate, Japan is very literate. Their culture is based on Confucianism, Buddhism, and Chinese culture. Rural Japan was militarized. Rural Japan was divided by those who owned land and those who were tenants. We see land exemption for the people who own land, for the people who own land, they were exempt from taxes and provided military service instead. Buddhist lands were also exempt from taxes, and capital divided by land by clan factions, culminating in the first victory of this individual who will become the first shogun in 1185. So the capital being divided by clan factions, culminating in the victory of Minamoto Yorimoto, who became the first shogun in 1185. The shogunate reduced the power of the capital and the imperial family. It established a shogunate shogunate center, leaving religious and ceremonial duties to Kyoto. Subsequent attempts by emperors to reclaim power failed, and we will see the establishment here of shogunate Japan. The shogunate in 1137, as I mentioned, moved the capital to Kyoto, and aesthetics of court life adopted by regional lords and samurais. The dual way, known as a union of the sword and the brush or writing, created a code of behavior called the Bushido, in which samurais were expected to be excellent warriors, educated, and loyal. In Japan at this time, Buddhist monasteries played an important role in shaping the rural and common culture. The monasteries provided alternatives to marriage, and we saw this also in China, that the monasteries gave women an opportunity for not being married. They provided an education including basic literacy, operated as landowners, innkeepers, and advisors to all the people of the classes. The most popular sects included Zen Buddhism, Tendai, and Shingon. Zen particularly popular with the samurai, who founded Zen's emphasis on repetitive tasks for helpful training. Shinto is combines animism with shamanism, with reference for kami or spirits of nature, inanimate objects, and all the beings. Shinto means way of the gods and encompasses many deities. And Shinto is another type of faith in Japan at this time. And we see the development, and you can see this if you've ever had a chance to go to Japan, you might notice the different Shinto shrines that are in the area in Japan. In the 8th century, a new phonetic writing system was developed, and there was a cultural divide between those who can read and write in literary Chinese and those who can read and write in the new system. Lastly, we're going to take a look at Vietnam. And for Vietnam, we're going to focus on, again, as you can notice from the map here, China is the neighboring country to the north. So much like what we saw with with China and its influence on Korea and its emphasis on Japan, we see a similar influence here in Vietnam. China is going to be in direct contact with Korea through about 968. After the fall of the Tang Dynasty, northern Vietnam began a series of independent dynasties, but China is going to have a real influence on Korea, or sorry, on Vietnam. Vietnam is going to help introduce different rices into China. A double strand rice will be developed and introduced into China, and that has major impact on their population. But Vietnam is going to break free, and then China is going to reconquer it, and things of that nature. So China and Vietnam had a lot of direct influence with one another, and the Tran dynasty of Vietnam was able to hold off the Mongol invasion, which is pretty impressive. Vietnam's economy is based on agriculture, especially a wet rice agriculture. There are as many as 300 strands of rice grown in northern Vietnam. But what we want to focus on here is the religious life. So prior to Buddhism entering Vietnam, Vietnamese religious life was centered on venerating ancestors. The first strand of Buddhism that arrives in Vietnam is Theravada and then Mahayana. At the local level, Vietnamese mixed both strands of Buddhism with ancestor worship. And literacy was tied to learning Chinese, particularly from the Li Dynasty onward. And we'll see some native writing systems were created in the 10th century that mixed Chinese characters with new characters and Vietnamese phonetics. But the big influence here, besides the direct contact with control and government structure over Vietnam by China, will be the connection that Vietnam has with Buddhism. So some of the similarities between all three of these societies interacting and these nations interacting is the religious connection. How did all three develop similar forms of religious identity in this time period? So after watching this and reading your chapter, you should be able to express that. Thanks, and I hope you found this interesting.